It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this lecture under the Great Questions in Krakow cycle. Copernicus Center is the host of this event, as well as the Copernicus Foundation. The co-funder and co-payer is the city of Krakow. And you can already probably see this catalogue of great questions. And there you have this white mysterious sheet of paper, and there you can jot down questions that you might think of during the lecture. Then these will be delivered to me. If they are proper and nice and interesting, then I'll pass these on to our guest. So by all means, please write down any questions you might want to put to our guest. That's it in Polish, and I'll move to English now. If there's something not working, please let me know.
Vincent Janik, marine biologist, expert in animal communication, especially and including the cognitive processes that underlie communication in marine mammals. And this is the subject of today's lecture. So please give a warm applause to our guest, and let's begin.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Also, thank you all for coming tonight. You can imagine, if you work in the field I work in, a question I get to hear a lot is whether dolphins have language. So I was very pleased to be invited and let you know how far we've gotten in the research on marine mammal communication. Now, before we talk about language, though, I want to take a step back and just ask a different question, which is, what is communication? Because all animals communicate, all social animals communicate. Birds sing to attract mates, a monkey might give a threatening call to chase away a competitor, and a mother and an infant exchange signals to try to stay together. All of these are forms of communication that we study in animals. And we are also concerned about terminology in that. So I'm going to show you one terminology slide now that explains in more detail the kind of language we're using for this. So when we talk about the mechanism of communication between two animals, we talk about a sender that encodes a message in a signal. The signal then travels through a channel that you see in blue here, which is just the environment between the sender and the receiver. And the receiver then extracts meaning from the signal. Now, the signal can sometimes change in the environment. If you're far away, you might not quite hear what exactly was being produced. And so therefore, what arrives at the receiver might be different from what comes out of the sender. And because of that, we are distinguishing between these two terms, message and meaning. The message is what the sender encodes, the meaning is what the receiver extracts. Now, it's not only the environment that affects that signal. It can also be things like a different interest of the animal. Say, for example, you have a territorial bird that's trying to keep others out. It's going to make a very loud noise. It's going to try to be as impressive and as scary as possible to other males. Now, the male that comes in, that's the receiver, has a different interest. That animal wants to work out, well, what are the weaknesses of this particular male so that I can intrude and maybe take over the territory. So the receiver may pay attention to very different aspects of the sound than what the sender wants the receiver to attend to. And so that can also introduce that difference between message and meaning. So I guess this is something that also applies to language. You say something and someone else hears things differently, extracts something else from it. And we do that all the time. So this is just really a description for communication in general. So do dolphins have language then, or do animals have language in general? Well, first of all, then again, we have to ask, what is language? And if you put language into Google or any other search engine, you will find a lot of different definition for language. And of course, you will find scientists debating over which one is the right one. For my purposes here, because I want to highlight a few things, I quite like this one. It says, language is the method of human communication, either spoken or written, consisting of the use of words in a structural and conventional way. There's a few words in here. First of all, it says it's human communication. So what we see here is language is just one form of communication. I said all social animals communicate, so therefore you have communication amongst humans as well, of course. And so our way of communicating, or one way that we communicate, is with language. The other thing that it says in there is the word human. So what we have in this definition is that language is defined as the human communication system, which immediately answers the previous questions. Dolphins do not have language because it's the human communication. But of course, it's a little bit of a cheap cop-out, isn't it? If we're trying to work out what are the similarities, perhaps. Now, if I think about language, to me, working on marine mammals, it's very clear that the communication that they between themselves use must be very different from ours. And one good way of illustrating that is actually looking at the phylogeny. So what this is a tree that shows you the history. So you have millions of years here on this side. So all the way down here is about 60 million years ago. Depending on who you ask, can be more. When mammals diversified. And you can see then that there's different branches going up. There's the marine mammals up here, the whales and dolphins up here. There's hoofed animals up here. You have the primates with humans, and then rodents here on the side. Now, that little red bit up there, that's us, and that's when, since when we had language. Which means that's a very recent discovery or development, if you want, in our evolution. Now, if we shared language with dolphins, and it was a homologous trait, which means that it comes from the same origins, then it would have had to evolve, not up here, but all the way down here, which then would mean all of these animals have language, and all of those guys that we think don't have language must have lost it. So horses, pigs, mice would all have lost language. Of course, that's an incredibly unlikely scenario. So what makes a lot more sense is this complex way of communicating has evolved here within the hominids, and we have other animals that have complex communication. And so now we got to think about how can we cross over, how can we still exchange information with them if we so choose. Now, one way in which we can try to whittle this down is to look at components of language that we might find in animals. Language has a lot of different aspects, but there are some key features that make language a good communication system, a complex one that's flexible. And I just have some examples here. So things like copying new sounds or inventing new sounds, that's really important because it allows us to create new signals for new objects. And if we then use them consistently for a particular object, then we can communicate about new things. So that's, for us, a very important feature. Inventing new sounds goes along with that, as I said. The other one is using sounds to refer to objects. To us, that's kind of normal, that I can use these things and, I've used these utterances and they refer to something in my environment so that I can talk about things. That is something that is also key for communication. And it's different, just to show you the difference. It's different, for example, if you step on my foot and I go, ow. Because that's a kind of involuntary response that doesn't specifically encode why I'm in pain, but it does tell you I'm in pain. And then also here, arranging sequences of sounds into meaningful utterances. So that refers to situations where the form in which different utterances are put together are important. And of course, for us, that's syntax, to try to kind of make sure we have certain rules, how we arrange signals, and then create sentences that mean more than just individual utterances. Now, you could study all of those, and as you can see here, they're all kind of focusing on the sender. These are all things that the sender is doing. Now, if you study animal communication, then of course, you got to understand what their utterances mean. You got to get to that. And that's very hard if I want to look at these complex things. So what psychologists have thought is, well, we're going to go to the other side. We're going to study the receiver, the animal receiving it. And so the two probably most famous guys for this in marine mammals are the late Ronald Schusterman and the late Louis Harmon, who have worked, Louis Harmon with bottlenose dolphins, Schusterman with Californian sea lions, to look at what Harmon called the linguistic capacities of marine mammals. Now, what he meant by that is he thought, well, I'm going to teach this animal an artificial language. I'm just making up signals and they stand for something, and then I string them together in a particular syntax, and he actually taught different types of syntax to two different animals. And then I look whether they can cope with that. The way that looks is, this is one example where hand signals were being used. So the experimenter would give certain signals. For example, in this case, it would say, leap over pipe. So that's 3 signals, and then give the animal a signal to start the behavior, and then the animal would display the behavior. Now, by doing that, initially that just looks like a simple trick. I can teach a dog with one hand signal to do something that I train it to do. That has nothing to do with linguistic capacities. And in fact, Schusterman, who did this with a sea lion, was arguing exactly that everything that Harmon found was effectively conditioning. Just a conditioning as you would condition a dog, and has nothing to do with linguistics or with language. Now, to go a little bit further, and that's in fact why he did this on a sea lion, because he thought that was a great system, because no one thinks that sea lions have linguistic capabilities, and that's why he wanted to show it in sea lions. Now, the vocabulary that Harmon managed to teach his animals, here are some examples of that. So there were first of all nouns, like hoop, frisbee, basket, water, person. But then there are verbs, actions, fetch, leap, spit, swim, wave, tail touch. Then there are modifiers that tell you how in relation to the object, over, under, in, or also which object. So sometimes there would be 2 pipes in the water, and then there's a left and a right one. Or through, for a hoop, for example. And they also managed to do and and question. So and is just stringing more than one activity together. And question they used to effectively ask the animal whether a particular object was present in the pool. And that was just to kind of test whether the animal understood what this stood for, even when the object wasn't present. Now, Harmon showed impressive learning capabilities in these dolphins, but I must agree, I think, with Schusterman that I have questions and doubts whether that really has to do something with linguistic capabilities specifically. The body of work is impressive and is very informative about animal cognition and learning, but how it really relates to dolphins communicate is something that's a very different question. Now, you've probably all heard about keyboard experiments that people have done with great apes. And I know that Matsuzawa was here, for example, to talk about his work. And of course, people have tried that with dolphins as well. Zitko and his colleagues, for example, have built this underwater keyboard. And what you see here is you have a diver demonstrating, pushing into these holes, and the animal is then supposed to do the same. And these studies have not been successful. In fact, with these keyboard studies, with the dolphin, there's normally one button that refers to food, and that's the one that the dolphin just continuously pressed. You can say that's a very smart move, but they just didn't engage in that kind of interaction. Now, here we come to an important point. When we talk about language and when we talk about, I used the term meaning earlier, philosophers would argue that actually just having an association between a signal and an object is not enough to really say the signal has meaning. To them, in language, what is important is actually to understand the intention. First of all, not only do I tell you something, I also intend to do that, and you recognize that I have the intention to inform you. And that is a key component of our interaction, and so therefore a key component of language. I can, for example, see dark clouds in the sky, and that tells me that it's going to rain. The cloud is not trying to tell me that it's raining. I just use that as a cue. And so that's a different kind of meaning from what we use in language. Now, what you could say here is that the fact that these studies so far have failed is that maybe these animals do not have an intention to communicate with us, but actually use these challenges that we present to them really just as that, as challenges, learning challenges, where they have to do something to get food. And that certainly is also, to a certain extent, the criticism of Harmon's work. Now you must think, well, what is he going to tell us about language? This doesn't seem to work. What I'm interested in is really to kind of ask more of what the animals do themselves and go back to those individual features that we talked about earlier. So the one I want to start with is vocal learning, being able to copy sounds in your environment. Now, these are examples of all the mammals, of all the animals that have been shown to be able to copy new sounds. And there's some that you well know, obviously. So there's a European robin up there, which occurs around here. They learn their songs, and it's a very good example for this. There's parrots. Everyone knows about parrots. There's also hummingbirds, perhaps a less famous case. And then amongst the mammals, there's seals here, bats, elephants, and whales and dolphins. And of course, last but not least, us. Now, one thing that is interesting about this slide is there is something missing here. And if you go back and think back about the evolution of language and the tree that I showed you, well, our closest relatives are not on the slide. To us, it's very important in our languages to be able to learn these utterances and then use them. But all the work on non-human primates has only shown flexibility in these animals, which is surprising because it's so important in language. And of course, that is why there was a lot of research effort trying to look for vocal learning in non-human primates. Now, the other extreme is animals that really shouldn't be able to copy human language can. So I'm going to play you an example on the guy here on the lower left, which is this harbor seal, Hoover, that was hand-raised in the New England Aquarium. And here is what his sounds sound like. So if you have experience with seal sounds, that's nothing like a seal sound. And in fact, if you kind of, the people reporting this case in the 80s were saying that you can actually understand what he's saying and that he even has a New England accent. So what happened with this animal was it was hand-raised by a human and started to copy the sounds in its environment, and that's how we know that seals can do that. This animal didn't use language in a useful or in a functional way, I should say. So you couldn't have a conversation with it, but it was producing these sounds. Now, I can ask why these animals learn in the first place. Now, I already talked about birdsong, and birdsong is something that is very specific. It's primarily males doing it. They are attracting females with it or keeping other males away. And so, of course, song is something that, and the complexity of song, the diversity of song that results from learning is what can give me information about the fitness of an animal, and that's probably the context in which this has evolved in birds. So very different from how we use sounds. Now, seals and whales and bats also all sing. So it's possible that that is the origin of learning sounds for these, but it's not something like language. It is more like song. But then there are these other animals that don't really produce song. So elephants don't sing, parrots don't sing. And while the great whales all sing, dolphins don't either. Toothed whales don't either. This is a beluga up there. Now, we can do tests with those animals and see whether they can copy sounds, and you do find that they do. Again, I'm going to show you an example. The first one, again, is a beluga that's been claimed to copy human speech. You will hear at least the rhythm and pattern of human speech in it, and again, it doesn't sound like a normal beluga. So listen to this. This is by someone called Sam Ridgway, who has recorded this animal. I hope that's not all you are hearing as I'm talking to you, but you can see the kind of rhythm, and again, it sounds very different from a real beluga whale. Now, the problem, of course, is if I study animals that have a very different way of producing sound, these animals have a new structure in their forehead to produce sound that's different from our vocal cords. They have vocal cords, but they're not using them for making sound because they have to produce sound in water. So what we really need to do is we got to ask, well, is it actually possible to produce human sounds for them? And the answer is not really, not easily. What they can do is this, but a whale or a dolphin can't really go much further than that, I think. So it's better to try to see how flexible they are within what they're capable of. And this graph here on the left-hand side is showing a study from Richards and colleagues out of Harmon's lab, in fact, as well, in fact, that demonstrates this really nicely. What this is a spectrogram. So what you have here is frequency or pitch, and this is time. Now, if you have a flat line here, then that's just a flat frequency, like a whistle that goes, so no modulation. If I have something that is modulated, say, for example, this part here that goes up and down and up, it sounds something like, goes up, down, up. And so we're using these spectrograms to look at sounds, because especially when sounds are high frequency or very fast, it's very difficult for our ear to distinguish between them. So we're using those to visualize what these sounds look like. Now, looking at this image, what you find is you have these nice lines of frequency modulations, and then there's a little arrow in all these parts here. And this was a bottlenose dolphin, so this species here on the right, that was trained to copy sounds, and the arrow indicates where the dolphin starts its copy. Now, if you look across here, he's doing a pretty good job. There is some cases like here where Richard's played sounds that have this abrupt frequency change that's very unusual. And the dolphins can't really do that, but it still produces a modulation in that particular frequency band. So the fact is, if I whistled a melody for you and asked you to copy it and would spectrogram it, then the spectrograms would not be much better than this. So they are very good at this. And that's, of course, a great experimental study to just show that they can learn new sounds. Now, what does this look like? I have a little video that shows you how we do those kinds of tests. So what you see in the video is an underwater shot of an animal in this setting. And what you have here is there's an underwater speaker over here, and there's an underwater camera looking at what the animal does, and it hears a sound, and then it's being rewarded if it copies it. And these spectrograms will come up here in the upper right corner of this video. So I'm going to just play this through. And you hear the wee there of the trainers that is a part of the reward actually, as well as the fish for the animal knowing that it's done the correct sound. So this is how you can kind of test these type of things. But again, it just still doesn't shows us kind of capabilities of these animals. So the real question then is, what about dolphin communication? What about their own communication? Are they really using these skills when communicating with each other? Or can I just train them and push them far? And so the rest of the lecture really, I want to tell you about the research done in my lab that is trying to look at how dolphins communicate and highlight some of the ways in which these animals use complex skills. The first one is a cross-fostering experiment, not one that we conducted voluntarily, but when you go to zoos, you sometimes have scenarios where animals of different species are kept together. This was a rhesus dolphin that you see at the bottom here, quite a different species, that's stranded as an infant with its mother, and the mother died, and there weren't any rhesus dolphins that it could be kept with. It could also not be set free again because it was too young, so it was kept with bottlenose dolphins and effectively grew up in this group of bottlenose dolphins. But it was still a very young animal, and if learning is important for these animals to develop their own repertoire, then I would expect that, well, if they suddenly only hear bottlenose dolphin, that changes their calls. And that's exactly what we find with this animal. So this graph here shows you different factors of these calls, and effectively these clouds here are representations of individual whistles of these animals. And how close they are together in this graph means how similar they are to each other. So you have this here, and they have this kind of, it looks like it's an explosion, but that actually the lines all originate from the centroid. So this is the central point of all of these whistles in this acoustic space, if you want. And so what you have here is the rhesus dolphin with all these kind of calls, and then you have closest to it these red clusters. And then you have, and those are the bottlenose dolphins that it was raised with. And then up here, you have a cluster that's furthest away, which is rhesus dolphins from the wild. So what a rhesus dolphin should sound like. And what you see there is interesting, that the rhesus dolphin that was raised by bottlenose dolphins, its sounds are actually most like those of the bottlenose dolphins it was kept with. And those clusters that are closest here, B2 and B1, are the female that more or less adopted this animal, so that we saw the rhesus dolphin swim with most of the time, and the other one is the dominant male in the pool. So you kind of see that clearly the animal has used these as models and then shaped its own whistles accordingly. Now, this is the communication between the dolphins. We don't know what it is about, but you can see here already that learning plays a role in the vocal development of the animal. Now, the classical case, though, for dolphin communication, and the one that I spent a fair amount of time on, are the signature whistles. And David and Melba Caldwell found in the 1960s that if you take a dolphin and you put it into a separation, into its own pool, then it will produce one whistle over and over and over again. But each dolphin produces its own individually distinctive whistle in that situation. Now, this isn't the only whistle they have, but this is a kind of, it seems like, you know, an isolation call, perhaps, if you want, where the animal is trying to make contact is producing this whistle. Here are some examples of those. So each row are the whistles of one animal up there. And these are 4 animals. So you have 4 rows of whistles that look very much alike, 3 different versions of the same whistle. And you have 4 animals and what they do when they are kept in that way. And to just kind of see how different they are, so you can already look at the shapes. There are these 2 U shapes here, and this has very little modulation. I'll just play you those examples because you will be able to hear those differences. They're quite drastically different. So you see the different pitch, but also in the duration and in the modulation pattern. Now, on the right-hand side here is something I wanted to show you because I want to tell you a little bit about how we study these things. This dolphin carries what's called a DTAC. So this is a suction cup computer that has 2 microphones and accelerometers that can give you information about its depth and swimming speed and orientation. So this is one of the ways in which we can study dolphin communication if we can get close enough to attach the suction cup tag on the animal. And so this is one way of studying who's making what sound and in what situations. Those are the two sounds again. Now, if I go back and look at isolation calls in other animals, though, it is striking how different these are between animals. Here's an example of squirrel monkeys in comparison to bottlenose dolphins. So the squirrel monkey isolation calls all have more or less the same shape. If you look at that, what you see is that you have, you know, a kind of arched shape in all of these. It's different. This one kind of looks like it's interrupted. It's only very brief here at the end. But they're all of the same overall shape. And squirrel monkeys are born with these. If you take a newborn squirrel monkey into isolation, it will make a call like this. If you take a newborn bottlenose dolphin isolation, it will not make a signature whistle. It will make all kinds of whistles. The difference really is that in squirrel monkeys there's a strong genetic predisposition going along with the finding of very limited vocal flexibility. In the bottlenose dolphin you find great variety. Now, the question, of course, is how do bottlenose dolphins then get their signature whistle? How does that happen? And so for that we can look at the development of whistles. And so what we have here is newborns that we have followed from very early on throughout their lives to see when the whistle emerges. And here's one example of an animal called Nami. And this animal, these are just example recordings from different days after birth. And you see that there's quite different sounds here at the start. But then what happens after about a month is you have this multi-loop structure here, so these 3 hums that it's producing as a whistle. So it seems like this only develops gradually. And in fact, this is an animal, when you then look at who is the model for this, who is the most like this whistle, what you find with animals in zoos at least is that that's often the mother. And in fact, Nami is one that has the whistle that's most similar to its mother. So this is the whistle of the mother and of Nami in the end. And they are very much alike. Now, the dolphins do produce diverse whistles and different ones. And if you look at the diversity in the wild where the animals hear and listen to a lot more dolphins, their own signature whistles become more diverse. But what this shows is that clearly these whistles are kind of developed in that the animal is copying something in its environment and then is starting to modify it to make up its new and unique whistle. So the next question then is, when do dolphins use these whistles? What are the contexts? And why do we think that they are these isolation calls? Well, the call was that you see here on the upper left have already kind of pointed at it. It's mostly in isolation. So, and what happens when we repeated that in many cases, these are animals on the upper right that are investigated for veterinary purposes. It's kind of a health assessment where animals are temporarily out of the water. Again, more than 90% of each animal's whistles are these signature whistles. If you go into the wild and you follow animals in the wild like you have on the lower right here, then it varies from 30 to 70% of their whistles are signature whistles. The other whistles are of other types, and I come back to those other whistles as well. Interestingly though, here on the lower left, if you put all animals into one pool and they can all see each other, then they don't produce signature whistles very much at all. So that kind of shows nicely that it really is a kind of contact call, a cohesion call for animals to stay together when they are further apart from each other. Now I'm talked about wild dolphins down here on the right and what whistles they make, and I showed you the suction cup tag. Just to give you an idea of how this is generally done in terms of how we do this research, here is a kind of little animation that shows you how this happens. So what we do normally when you have two dolphins that interact with each other is you have one swimming producing sounds that the other one receives. And what we do is we put different microphones in the water. So what you see in this part here is the dolphin made the sound, and you have three microphones, and what you could see as it comes through is that the sound first arrives here, and then with a very small delay arrives at the second microphone. And we can record that. We can record that difference in the time of arrival. And then of course there will be a third spike when the sound reaches the hydrophone that's the furthest away. Now, if you record this kind of thing, what you can then do is you can work out where the dolphin could have been to create this difference in time of arrival. So if I'm comparing the first two peaks, they are the arrival differences between those two, then because there's a certain time delay, just from the physics of it, there is a line, a hyperbola, which is the only location where the dolphin could have been to produce the sound. So this is what's drawn here. So anywhere along here the animal could have been, and I would have gotten this delay. Now the good thing is I have more than one pair of hydrophones, and if I do this with more than one, so now I'm comparing those two and draw the line, and then finally the last one and draw the line, they all intersect in one location. And that then is the location of the animal making the sound. This is how we study this in the wild when we can't attach tags. Now, and what you then get is graphs like this, where you follow them with a board in the wild, and this is the hydrophone array here, and these are hyperbolas. When you use more than 3 hydrophones, you get more hyperbolas, and you get that intersection that tells you where the animal was that was making a sound. Now, with that method, one of my students, Nicola Quick, has found that if dolphins meet each other at sea, what happens is they're either both groups are quiet, and then they pass each other by. But if they start whistling, what they do is they exchange signature whistles back and forth between the two groups before they join. So it's almost like a greeting ceremony where animals come together and exchange these whistles before they join. And these are examples of this here. They look a little messy because there's a lot of other noise in the sea. So you see these kind of large-shaped whistles here, and then that smaller one produced twice. So these are coming from 2 different directions from the 2 different groups. The same here down there, these kind of hums, and then this kind of squiggle up here. And down here, something that's kind of M-shaped, followed by an upsweep. So you have the M, upsweep, M. And so those exchanges happen right before they meet each other. I can play you the lowest one as an example. You can see why we're using spectrograms. They're very squeaky and high and are very difficult to tell apart if you just listen to them. Now, so far this story makes a lot of sense. They're producing very diverse signals because they're living in an environment that is very noisy, and so therefore they have to be drastically different to stick up over the noise and also stick up over other animals. But they're still learners, and so how does this work if animals can copy each other? And in fact, Peter Tayek has found this in just 2 animals, that the signature whistles here on the left-hand side are from Scotty, and the right-hand side are from Spray. And what you see here are examples of Spray producing the same whistle as Scotty. So Spray is copying, and of course, if this is for individual recognition, then that is not a good system, because it means that somehow I'm now getting confused. It's not just one animal making that sound, but more than one. And Tayek titled his paper with a question mark at the end because he just had those 2 animals. But we looked at this further, and we found that in fact this happens in the wild as well. So these are examples here on the left, exchanges between wild dolphins that are I'm pressing the wrong buttons, sure, sorry. On the left here, these are exchanges between wild dolphins where they're producing two different signals. On the right, you see animals matching each other's whistles in close succession. So these interactions where one animal is copying the other happens as well. This here is Inverness in Scotland where we studied this. Now, this of course raises the question of whether this is just a method to confuse other dolphins, or does it help in some way? And so the idea that we had is that perhaps these are being used to address other animals. And in fact, Tyke first brought this up as well when he was discovering matching. So the next question then is, can wild dolphins use signature whistle copies to address social companions, just like we do with names? So we did this with a playback experiment. So here we did this in the Moray Firth, which is up near where I just, the image I just showed you. And then also in St. Andrews Bay, right where our institute is located. And you see that our boat and also our equipment has changed over the years a little bit, because it was a long time apart that we had done these two different types of recordings. And the setup was this: we play the animal in a test. Our hypothesis, our prediction is that if I play a dolphin's signature whistle, it will react to that whistle, but it won't react to signature whistles of others. It should be selective. And so this is what we did here. We had 12 copy treatments, which are whistles being played that are of the animal that's present. Then we had 9 familiar controls, which are whistles of other animals in the population. And then we had 10 unfamiliar controls as well, to see whether they just react to a strange stimulus. Maybe our playback isn't so good, and then they should react to unfamiliar ones as well. And then we looked at the vocal response, whether they reply or not reply vocally. And we also looked at movement and vocal rate, whether they would turn around, come to the boat as if they're being addressed and called over, and also whether they would call more or less. And the most striking result in this was really the vocalization. So there are two examples again. The upper one is these upsweeps, and then you see one just faintly here. These are very, very dark because they're recorded right next to my speaker when I'm doing this. Same down here, you see this hump, and then you see the animal doing it in reply. These numbers here are similarity values on a scale of 1 to 5, so it shows that there's high similarity. I have an example of the lower one, and this is slowed down, so it's easier to hear when it's slowed down, as an acoustic example. So that was the first one here. So that's one of the examples of the animals calling back. And in fact, you do find this, that in the results is that the copies here, the black ones, are the replies. They occur primarily here when you copied the whistle of theirs. So they're producing their signature whistle when they've been copied. Familiar controls and unfamiliar controls don't have the same effect. There is a couple that reacted to familiar controls, and we think that it might be because actually the owner of the signature whistle was not far away. Now, the question that leaves us with is why would dolphins need these learned signature whistles, and when other animals don't? And the first answer is that they live in fission-fusion social structures, and what that means is pretty much our social structure. We have preferred individuals that we spend time with, but throughout the day, group composition constantly changes. If I followed any one of you around and would write down who you are with, I would get a huge turnover of individuals, but some individuals would show up again and again. In that kind of structure, you actually interact with a lot of different individuals, and so you need to distinguish between a lot of different individuals, which of course needs a clear label. The other example, and what this slide shows is a study by Connor of the kind of social relationships here of females and males at Shark Bay and their ranges and how they overlap to kind of show that these animals are all in the same space interacting with each other. The other answer is the environment. These animals live in a very different environment from us. So there's this whole range of things that are different. First of all, there's very low visibility. There's limited use of olfaction. Olfaction means a sense of smell. Obviously, you don't use that underwater. There's few landmarks, so animals can't easily just kind of go, oh yeah, I saw this animal back by this rock and I'm going back to it, because most animals live offshore and there aren't rocks lying around. That might work near the coast, but not far away. There's no den. The animal can't just leave its offspring in a den or in a nest. Currents move individuals. If you're in the water and you're not moving, you're still moving, and you don't even perceive it necessarily, so that makes it very unpredictable where animals will be once they've left. Voice characteristics may change with depth. We can tell each other sometimes apart by voice if you can listen to each other, but because these animals are diving and they're producing sound with air-filled cavities, what happens is that their voices change with depth, so it's not a reliable indicator. There's also very high background noise. Sound travels well underwater, but that's not only a blessing, it also a curse, because you then hear animals from very far away. And in fact, on ideal conditions, you can hear a dolphin over 10 kilometers away. Now imagine you could hear right now everyone talking within 10 kilometers. You would have to face, you would have to deal with a very high level of background noise that you somehow have to be heard over. And of course that's the last point, that sound travels much faster and also with less transmission loss, and so because of that range you also have additional noise. Now I've only talked about signature whistles so far because they're very exciting and we've learned a lot about them, and they are unique in that they are these learned labels for other individuals that others copy, and so the question then is, are these animals referring to each other in some way, which is a question that we can't answer yet. But what about all the other whistles? So I said earlier that in some situations only 1%, only 50% of signature whistles. So here's an example of a whistle repertoire of a group of 11 bottlenose dolphins in Valencia in a zoo. And what you have is each line on here is a whistle type that they're using, and the black dots appear when they're actually using them over a period of 2 months. And so the first 11 down here will be their signature whistles that occur every so often. But I just want to show you this to put this into perspective, because there are a lot of other whistle types that these guys are using. Some of them they don't use very often, but there are a lot of other whistle types, and we know very little about these. We're only just starting to scratch the surface, and in fact this great variability is something that is challenging for us. But to just give you one example at the end about other calls that they use, is one call that we discovered that is associated with this kind of behavior, where you have dolphins chasing large fish. This is mostly salmon in Scotland. Can these animals in fact use those sounds, use sounds somehow to let others know that there is fish around? So in those situations, certainly it would be also good to have signature whistles and maybe address others. So, can animals refer to other individuals in that context and somehow make their foraging more effective? Well, interestingly, we did find that the animals use more signature whistles and more whistling in those hunting situations. But the other thing that really stood out was a very different call that they made, which is the bray call of bottlenose dolphins. And this is what this sounds like. Doesn't sound like a whistle at all. It's a really different type of sound. They are indeed called bray sounds because they kind of remind you of a donkey's bray. Now, these are sounds that you hear when you see what you saw on the previous slides, animals rushing towards one location, fish leaping. And so one of the things that we did is we kind of compared when these animals are producing those. So what you have here is the results of this. We looked at the movements of dolphins and we looked at where the bray call came from. So this is movements away from where the bray came from. This is movements at the position where the bray was heard, and this is movements towards where the bray came from. And then you have here in black the 15 seconds before the bray occurs and 15 seconds after. And how often you find these the fast swimming towards, away, or at position. And what you see here is that no matter whether there is a bray before or after, there's no real difference in how many animals are quickly swimming away from the location. There's quite a lot of fast swimming after the bray at the location, and then even more fast swimming towards that location. So this is typical what you find for a food call, when an animal produces a call and everyone rushes towards that location. And food calls are, of course, have been studied in other animals as referential calls that are interesting to look at because they do refer to other aspects and often are very stereotypical. And bray calls are also quite stereotypical. So this is one of the opportunities where we can look at yet another call and see whether it is something that perhaps is referential. Now, to finish off, going back to our questions, do dolphins have language? What I would say is no, they have complex communication, and the intentionality in this is unclear, as I said earlier. But language is not the only complex communication system, and that's the case even in humans. If you think about it, we have more than one system to communicate. And so one of those, for example, is body language or music. If you think about music, music can give information, but it's very different from language. So there are other ways of complex communication. And my worry is that by trying and focusing so much on language, trying to find language in dolphins, we may overlook levels of complexity that are present in animals, but that is different from our own communication. So honing in on trying to show that dolphins have language actually as blinkers us from recognizing perhaps how they communicate and how their communication works. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, it works. Thank you very much. And I hope we do have some pieces of white paper with words scribbled on them. Is there anyone collecting those that can bring them? Are there any questions? So now there's the time to abuse my role as a host and ask my own questions because you didn't do it quickly enough. And I think I have 3. And I will ask all of them, even though you may have questions, but I will ask mine first because I'm the host and you are not. My first question is, well, I have a serious one as well, but when you watch films and there are dolphins squeaking, like a feature films, do you understand what they're saying? Do you have these moments like, well, this dolphin shouldn't be saying that, it's not good?
In many cases, actually, it really shouldn't, because it's not a dolphin you're listening to. So the most famous programs, and especially Flipper at the start, it was a human making those sounds, not a dolphin. You listen to how high-pitched those sounds are, and they weren't very attractive to the producers to produce because you could hardly hear them. And in fact, our hearing gets worse with age, which means that the older you get, the harder it is to hear those high frequencies. So they brought someone in to make those sounds, and so they're not usually dolphin sounds. However, obviously nowadays that's slightly different, and people do use recordings, but they're usually not from the situation in which the animals are being shown, but they're just kind of dubbed.
So there would be like a dolphins playing and the sound would be a horrified dolphin or something like this, right?
Well, that is possible if you don't know what you're playing, of course.
Exactly, but you would know.
Well, it depends a little bit, right? So if you're asking about that particular example, so an animal that is under stress does sound different from one that isn't, and so that's something that is recognizable. But there's a lot of other contexts, and it's difficult to tell which one belongs to which. That's why I showed the slide about the repertoire and how many whistles there are that we know very little about.
And the second question was actually about the voice change, because if there's the paper with a title. I like these kind of papers. The title is a sentence. It's excellent. Dolphins do not use voice cues for individual recognition. Could you comment on that? What is it that they don't do? Because they use signature whistles, but this is a different thing.
Yeah, so this is most easily explained again by comparing it to the human voice, and the signature whistles have been called names, but they are like names in that others copy them and use them to address animals. They're also not like names because they're not given to the dolphin; it develops it itself, and also they don't mean anything beyond labeling that animal. If you think about human names, every human name also means something beyond just labeling an individual. So the difference between signature whistle and voice is the same as if I can talk to you right now and you're now familiar with my voice, and I don't have to say my name, even if you can't see me, to recognize who I am. But you can have a computer voice say my name and you would understand what that's referring to. And so that's really the difference here. Is the question is, why do animals develop these very distinctive labels when most animals also have these voice differences? Because the reason we have different voices is because of subtle differences in our exact anatomy of our vocal tract. This is something I refer to when I talked about in the environment. As these animals dive, the shape of these cavities actually changes, which would mean that their voices change, and so those voices aren't reliable. In the paper, we looked at whether you can actually get animals to respond to just non-signature whistles, so some of these other whistles produced by an animal, in the same way as to signature whistles, and they just don't. So they don't turn to their offspring when they hear a non-signature whistle. And it might have two reasons. One is that they may really not pay attention to voice cues, and so maybe that is not something that they're looking at, but they can still perceive them, or they actually really have trouble allocating voice cues to an individual because of it.
Okay. Is there something you want me to be asked in public, or are you too timid? No, I do have. So in the meantime, so what I will do, thank you very much. What I will do, I will sort through them and see what can be done. And now I have a third one, even more serious. Well, there's you say that it's not language, and the way you defined language, there was reference to meaning. Is this a usable term when talking about animal communication? How could you possibly assign meaning to a vocalization? And please excuse me, please answer the question to public, because I'm going to be huddled over here going through the pieces of paper. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, of course. Well, yeah, that's a good question. And I think the reason that there is different perceptions of what meaning is because different fields sometimes use similar words out of our normal repertoire to refer to different things. So the first slide I showed you, where I talked about the sender and the receiver and message and meaning in that, that was by a scientist called Smith, who was concerned about these differences about what's being encoded and what the receiver actually takes from it, and that those are not the same thing. So he decided to use the words message and meaning. I don't think necessarily with thinking about what meaning would, how meaning would be defined by a philosopher, for example. And then actually later in philosophy, the topic about natural and non-natural meaning, which is brought up by Grice, that is the distinction about intentionality that I refer to, where it's not just important that there's some information going across, but that I have an intention to inform you, and you recognize this as well. That's my intention to inform you. So only then, according to that definition, do you actually have meaning in this exchange. And I feel, I think we just have to be clear with definitions. We have to really clearly define what we say, and there's a risk of using terms that everyone uses every day in science, and especially in this field is something that happens a lot. And I've talked about how many different definitions there are for language. Same is true for terms like culture. It's very difficult to come up with that, so one has to just kind of have the right definitions.
And actually, I've received only excellent questions. I think I will read all of them. One was already answered about dolphin names, so I won't ask this one. But the one that I'm holding in front of me at the moment is probably a follow-up to the question. Does it mean that dolphins didn't cross the boundary between sign and symbol? This is how I understand it. This is the same problem as the problem of meaning, isn't it?
Well, it's similar. The problem is, one thing is the definitions, of course, but normally one other distinction that we make in communication research on animals is between the cue and the signal. So a sign or a cue can be something that's an indicator that something's about to happen, but it's not being given in that context. So to us, it's always really important to bring this back to evolution and to sort of think about how this evolved in the first place. So a signal is something that evolves in the context of information transmission. A cue is something that didn't evolve in the context of information transmission. An example for that is when, say, for example, I go running, and therefore I have stronger circulation, and so my skin turns red, and you can see that, and so you can see that I've just been physically active, for example. Now, I'm not turning red to tell you I've been running. It's just a kind of side effect, physiological side effect. While the signal would be if then through evolutionary change, suddenly there is a change in how my blood is being diverted, and so that, for example, the red becomes more obvious, and that would happen if there is an advantage to me in broadcasting this information out. And so this kind of transition in biology is an important one between a cue that animals can use to predict what happens in their environment and the signal that some natural selection has acted on and has actually evolved into a specifically selected trait.
Thank you. I have a whole bunch of questions related to interspecies relationships, I guess. So I'm going to just bunch them all into a single question. How good are dolphins in understanding a non-dolphin language? Specifically human, and there were whales mentioned. Do dolphins understand other species?
So that's a difficult question to answer because the context in which we can look at species understanding signals of others is again if they are relevant to that species. So if a dolphin hears a whale singing, that is not very relevant to the dolphin. So it's difficult to tell whether that animal makes any sense of it. I could probably train a dolphin to do something specific when it hears whale song, so it can pay attention to it, but in its natural life it has no real relevance, so therefore it would not really react to it.
But I mean, killer whales, would they be like plotting against dolphins and a dolphin would overhear it and then go like, oh, okay, so they are referring to me. If dolphins can refer to a large fish, could killer whales refer to a dolphin?
They could, but it would be a big mistake to do, right? Because
exactly.
one of the reasons why this, yeah,
a dolphin.
That's exactly what they're doing. Well, so they're not. Well, first of all, killer whales, we don't know whether they have a specific food call like this. But for the dolphins, the salmon can't hear sound well. And in fact, one of the reasons, one of the things that's interesting about this break call, so I'm just going to go into this briefly, is. What happens is everyone swims towards it, so maybe this is a food call, it's possible. But what's also unusual about this call is that it's much lower in frequency than most other dolphin calls. And that's strange. And it's actually so low that maybe salmon can hear it. And one of the other hypotheses of how this call is being used is that it may help the dolphin to change the fish behavior. So one possibility is that the dolphin produces the sound, and what salmon normally do is when they're being scared is they evacuate their swim bladder, so they kind of release gas out of the swim bladder and drop down to the seafloor. And interestingly, someone called Gordon Hasty from St. Andrews has done a study and looked at what depth these animals are producing these break calls, and interestingly the break calls were actually produced at quite great depth, while the salmon seem to be traveling more nearer the surface. And what could be is that the dolphin makes a sound and then the salmon basically comes down towards the dolphin. So it might actually make it easier for the dolphin to catch the salmon. In that case, and this is kind of goes back to the previous question, in that case the break call would only be a cue for those other dolphins coming in, because it didn't evolve to attract other dolphin, it evolved to manipulate the salmon's behavior. Now, but that's a very specific example. Dolphin here very broadly. If I go back to killer whales, so killer whales are very quiet when they're chasing marine mammals, because marine mammals can hear well, and it's been demonstrated quite clearly that they are effectively going quiet until there was a kill, and then they're starting to vocalize.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I will have to drop some questions. This is an update, I'm sorry, to anyone whose question is not spoken out. 2 questions about people. Well, I think we just had to ask this question. What do you think about John Lilly?
Well, John Lilly was a neuroscientist who was the first one to really, or one of the first people to study dolphins and dolphin communication. And the whole field really kind of started in the 40s and 50s when people first brought dolphins into aquaria. And so suddenly people could observe them, and people found that they're very easy to train, and there was a huge interest in that. Before that, people would just hunt dolphins and use them as another food source. So, at around that time, when there was this great excitement about dolphins, John Lilly wrote a book predicting that these animals have language, because he recorded these sounds, and his first publications were very serious publications describing those sounds for the first time. Now, he was a very good salesman, I guess, and this book was very successful. And in fact, the reason why we're asking whether dolphins have language is probably John Lilly, because this was such a strong influence that he had at the time on the general public, and actually also on research funders. So he got research funding to study this in more detail. I think the problem then was that he tried to show something using methods that others have used. So one of the idea was for the early great ape studies, one of the ideas was that if a great ape is being raised by humans, because of the interactions, there would be communication occurring, and then maybe the great ape would learn language, which wasn't successful, but it's an interesting thought, because the environment is such that, you know, it's conducive to learning. Now, Lilly did the same thing with one of his assistants, having a dolphin flooding an apartment only sort of this deep, and having a person, one of his research assistants, living with the animal. But the way in which he actually then started to collect data became non-scientific, because he had this assistant report on the interaction between her and the dolphin, which is problematic, because if you're interested in interaction between two, you need a third observer who's not part of the experiment. And the other thing was that he was very intensely trying to teach dolphins English, but you heard the example earlier of the beluga whale. these guys just can't really easily make those sounds, so it was not successful. And when that was not successful, he very much focused on human language. When that was not successful, then funding dried up. And also Lilly became more interested in understanding humans and started to experiment with LSD, in which case primarily, first of all, on humans, on himself, and so that influenced his research and actually veered him away from dolphins. And at that stage, then it became not very relevant for dolphin communication anymore. So I think he was to answer the question, coming back to the original, I think he was a pioneer in the field, and he has certainly published early on, first descriptions that were important, but then after that, just basically went down the wrong track.
Thank you. And by the way, if anyone of the organizing team wishes to stop me if there is a limited number of questions I may ask, this is probably a good time to start waving frantically into my direction. But up until that moment, I'm going to ask a very specific question. A question from a cognitive ethologist who asks about grammatical structures of bottlenose dolphins, referring to the works of Vyacheslav Ryabov.
This is a big question, whether dolphins have grammatical structures or syntax, and there is a few studies that show some very limited modification of meaning when you rearrange sounds or when animals rearrange sounds. These examples do not come from dolphins or whales. They come from meerkats and from primates. But they are very limited. And, we're talking about pairing one sound with one other sound, and so then the pair of them means something different from just the sound by itself. If we talk about full-blown syntax, that's a very different thing. But of course, it might be an origin, a kind of precursor to something like syntax. In marine mammals, people have really just only looked at structure in humpback whale song, and there are clearly rules in how the song is structured. That's very similar to bird song, where you have the same kind of rules. But again, going back to song, one of the problems is the message in a song is most likely the diversity of the song, not that every single element has a particular meaning that strings things together into a sentence. So it's very much unlike language, more like music. So for dolphins, when you look at sequences, they do not produce necessarily lots of whistles, but they do produce clicks at the same time. The break call that we heard is actually made up of clicks. So it's a different type of sound. And these clicks are tricky for us analyzing communication, because the dolphins use clicks for echolocation, just like bats. So they're producing a click, it travels out, they're listening for an echo, and that tells them what's in front of them and also how far away it is. But they're also using clicks for communication on top of that. And people haven't looked at clicks very much because they're fiendishly difficult to analyze, because not only are they high frequency, but they're also directional, which means that if I echolocate on you, it sounds very different to someone just being there. And if I then change and now echolocate this direction, then for the receiver, this sound sounds as if I've changed my sound, but I haven't. All I've done is I've turned, and because I basically have a sound beam, it sounds differently at the receiver. It makes it very hard to study that. I think that if there is any kind of potential for that, I would expect it in those clicks. In the whistles, I don't see any evidence for that.
Okay, thank you. Do dolphins make sounds to show each other something interesting? I think there was an experiment where dolphins were reportedly understanding the concept of something new. Was there? They were rewarded specifically for producing novel movements, if I'm not mistaken. So I guess, maybe piggybacking on that question, it is conceivable that they would have a concept of something interesting, or not?
So I think these are really two questions. One is, would a dolphin draw the attention of another one to something that's of interest? And that's an interesting one, because in theory, I just talked about that echolocation beam. So if you have a lot of experience with echolocation, then, and I'm pointing this way, and you're sitting over there, you would know that I'm not echolocating on you. You would actually be able to kind of tell that I'm facing somewhere else. We don't know how well this works and whether the dolphin can exactly say, oh yeah, he's echolocating in that direction, but there might be a cue just from the directionality of echolocation that effectively points to the target, which is an interesting idea. It's like an acoustic pointing almost.
But we do it visually. I mean, now I'm focusing on you and visualocating you, but now you know I'm not visualocating at the moment, right?
Yeah,
so
gaze following.
There's an analog.
Yes, yeah, there is. So gaze following is something that we use for that as well. Or we can point with our eyes. dolphins don't point with their eyes, but it's interesting to ask to what extent that they might have an acoustic pointer, and though there are studies underway looking at that, so I can't answer that yet. No, I forgot the second part.
No, I just
you were asking
referred
about
to
novelty.
the experiment with,
Yes.
with rewarding novel behaviors.
Yeah.
I thought maybe this could be related.
Yeah.
Maybe it isn't.
Yeah, the novel behavior one is tricky, so you can teach a dolphin to do something that it hasn't done before, but one thing with all of these experiments, also when you teach animals to actually mimic the movement of another dolphin, one of the things in which that can be convincing, if for example you do that with a chimpanzee, is you can have really complex arm or hand movements that another one can copy, and you're really convinced that that's a copying and that's novel. Dolphins don't have hands. They have fused vertebrae in the neck, so they can't really turn their head very much, except for river dolphins. And so they actually have a very limited repertoire of what they can do. So to think of something new for a dolphin to do, truly novel, is quite hard. So those studies are interesting, but there is the question of what really is new in the repertoire for movement. For sound, that would be different, because that's something, and obviously in sound they can produce completely new sounds when they develop their signature whistles, for example.
That was actually the first question that came to my mind, but I thought it's too weird. But since you've mentioned it, I thought, would it be feasible to give a dolphin novel ways of communicating through, biotechnology, like introducing a certain sound-producing object? I'm talking high, science fiction level, but no, it's not science fiction, it's realistic. Would that, I don't know if it would be ethical, but in your opinion, would the capability to produce new sounds through some sort of brain speaker plug-in, would it lead to novel linguistic behaviors in a dolphin? So not by asking them to mimic human sounds, but simply by giving them capability to produce new sounds.
Well, they're already capable of producing new sounds. So they're
something not naturally present in a dolphin.
Well, what you do then is just really expanding the repertoire. So you could for example try to modify the animal so that it can produce very low frequency sounds. What you do in that scenario is if you look at the capability of an animal, you can describe that as a space. So say this white circle, for example, is the space in which you can make sounds. You can make a new sound by anywhere in that circle making something, but I can't make something out here. So if I enlarge that circle, so I'm giving more capability, you can make theoretically even more sound, but the animals have such fine hearing that actually in this space they can already produce a tremendous amount, including things that you don't normally hear in their repertoire.
So that would have to be supplanted by a hearing aid.
Well, I think all it does really is increasing diversity. I don't think it would change how they communicate. Yeah.
Okay. Well, actually, it wouldn't be fair not to read the last piece of paper. I wanted to ask a final, nice, easy question, but now I have to read what's on the green one. So I don't know what to do now. Okay, there's going to be a pause for 5 seconds. And the person who wrote the green question will now think, did I do it right? Some suspense. Huh. Interesting. That's an interesting question. Do dolphins communicate for fun? There's a long introduction to the question that nothing in nature happens without a reason. Spending energy is always for a reason, but communicating for fun, like humans do, is something special. Do dolphins do it?
So I think that's a very good question, because it kind of highlights how we think about what the function of a call is. So in biology, we often kind of think about ultimate goals of signals, and the ultimate goal is to increase one's own success, specifically reproductive success, because that actually allows to give the genetic information that I have onto the next generation, onto more animals, and this is how genetic traits become successful. And that's something that biologists really focus on. So that's the ultimate side. However, of course that needs to be realized somehow in the animal. So an animal needs to do something. It needs to find a mating partner. It needs to do things. And so that motivation, of course, comes from somewhere else. And so these are mechanisms that immediately lead to something that we call proximate mechanisms. So these are the ones that effectively are the immediate reason for an animal doing something. Not the one that is sometime in the future, there will be more offspring, that's all very well, and that biologically that makes a lot of sense. But there's also an immediate reason for it. And this immediate reason can actually be linked closely with emotion and enjoyment. So if there's a physiological state that is enjoyable, then I will seek that out, and that will make me produce a particular behavior. So you could, for example, say maybe a whale sings for fun, because right now this is something that makes the animal feel good. It then has the effect that females listen to it and they come over and they find this interesting and they mate and they will have offspring, and so therefore this genetic trait that singing creates fun is something that is passed on to the next generation, and this is how this trait becomes successful. So the answer, I think, I would say is yes, I think that most animals, including us, are doing things for reasons that are very immediate to us, to our immediate experience, because that is what actually makes us do it. But it's really how evolution implemented certain things to happen in a sense so that it also results in increased reproductive success.
Yeah, I think Franz de Waal has a similar theory about the reasons why we're empathic, right? We help others, and pain of others is unpleasant to us, so we help to avoid this unpleasantness, but this is just a proximate cause, wouldn't it be?
Exactly, yeah.
And sex is fun too, for probably the same reason.
That would be the same motivator, yes.
And the final question, I think it's a good way to end the day. Your job seems very interesting and exotic. What do you like the most about your job? How does your typical day of work look like? These are the questions that we really enjoy at the end of the day, don't we?
Yes, so that is also a good question, because I am being asked that, especially by young people who maybe want to go into this career. And the one thing that's a reality, I think, for most researchers is that you spend a small amount with the actual study, with the subject you're studying or with the topic you're studying in the field, and then you spend a very long amount at your computer trying to analyze it. And you've seen some of the graphs here. I haven't gone in too much into the detail and the analysis techniques of this. So my typical day, I would say, looks like sitting at a computer all day. But I'm also fortunate to be able to come to places like this to talk about what I do, and of course also go into the field and do these recordings and observe the animals themselves, and that's certainly very enjoyable, and that's the motivator for me. That's what I think is fun. I also think it's really fun to analyze those sounds and find out about what these sounds mean and find something out about the animals. So there is a real kind of buzz there as well when you find something new, and that is fun too. But I think, unfortunately the normal day, most of it is computer work.
Just today I read a paper about chimpanzee behavior, and the core of the paper was just a spreadsheet in Excel with about 6,000 individual lines, each containing numbers representing chimpanzee behavior. So somebody had to sit through the creation of this giant Excel spreadsheet with numbers. I guess you probably have some understanding of the process, right? Creating huge, boring spreadsheets based on these beautiful animals, right?
Absolutely, there is that, but of course nowadays we're really trying to, so what I do a lot more is I spend a lot of time writing results up, but also what we would do is we would spend the time coding and have the computer do the analysis I want to do, so I wouldn't necessarily look through that by myself and kind of count how often something occurs. But nevertheless, actually, sometimes that's a good thing to do, because there is some kind of intuition in humans as well. We're very good at pattern recognition. I can program a computer to recognize some pattern in data, and that's all very well. But I'm also very good at pattern recognition. I have a lot of experience with these things. So actually, sometimes it's fun to look at those raw data and try to see what patterns there might be. And then we can develop experiments asking whether that pattern that I think is there is really there. But that can be useful as well, and I sometimes do that. But it takes a lot of time, and unfortunately, that's hard to come by.
Thank you very much. And wait, with your applause, I'm going to do all the thank yous once again. So thank you to all the organizers, to the city of Krakow. And one thing I did not do, and I should do, is definitely these handsome pictures that you saw outside, and all of you seeing this on the screens of your computer. I hope you do see them as well. They were produced by Baniak. We thank him as well very much for his fantastic imagery. And thank you, Professor Janik, for visiting us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now we magically switch into Polish again. So dziękujemy Państwu serdecznie za przybycie. Proszę się rozliczać.
Thank you so very much. Please return the headsets. I hope everything has been working. And please visit us again and remember about our meetings and remember about the Copernicus Center and what we do.